Hi friends, welcome to what I like to call, in a tongue-in-cheek kind of way, the greatest spring garden video ever. Our vegetable garden is 40 feet by 40 feet or 1,600 square feet. And I like to tell people how big our garden is because it's similar in size to many people's front and backyards where I feel they have the opportunity to grow food instead of lawns. In addition to growing food here, our garden is a place where rabbits, squirrels, and crows all come to sample our fresh produce. But there are lizards and butterflies, bees and earthworms, and countless other seen and unseen creatures which pass through or make this sacred place a home. And of course, our two African pygmy goats, Alice and Charlotte, live back here. They too love to sample the produce. Here they're enjoying some kale, but they're an important part of the weed control and will make frequent appearances throughout this video. We call this happy little space Rancho Reiso. We had quite a busy spring here, so we cover a lot of ground in this video. So to accommodate this era of short attention span theater, I've broken this video into bite-sized segments, which you can watch individually, or kick back, get comfortable, and enjoy the whole show. March 20th is the official start of spring for 2017, but it came a few days earlier with the arrival of Tomatomania. I went to their largest sale, which is at Tapia Brothers in the San Fernando Valley, nestled in the shadow of the busy 405 freeway. Tomato heads and gardeners converge on this mega sale, which boasts over 300 unique varieties. And although I had started most of my tomatoes from seed, I couldn't resist coming to pick out a few gems. Now I tend to be a seed saver, so I look for heirloom varieties, and you have to read the descriptions carefully. For example, this one called Heirloom Green is actually a hybrid. And I'm not sure a tomato that's called Viagra could have been around long enough to qualify as an heirloom. I did, however, find quite a few tomatoes I look forward to planting in my garden, and I consider the sale a great way to kick off the spring season. Back in February, I had started germinating my pepper and tomato seeds. So by April, these little seedling starts were large enough to transplant into their own individual cups to start hardening off. Many an early spring morning you could find me out by my propagation table, and the process went something like this. I would start by poking some holes in the bottom of the cup for drainage, and then write on that cup exactly what variety of tomato or pepper I was transplanting. I'd then fill the cup up with a blend of soil that included biodynamic compost, some of my own homemade compost, as well as some organic potting soil. I'd carefully remove each seedling from the seedling tray and place it in that cup. A little more soil and some water. It was a process that repeated itself over and over throughout the spring. After a while, I definitely found my rhythm and got pretty good and quick at the process. And I started more tomato and pepper plants than I could ever grow, so I had plenty to give to friends. In addition to starting spring crops, I started hundreds of sunflowers on this table and gave so many away to friends, local elementary schools, and other acquaintances. Now, compost is such an important topic to a gardener that I'm making an entire video exclusively dedicated to the subject. Often called a gardener's black gold, compost is how we amend the soil. A lot of commercially available blends start with a base of either cow manure or chicken manure, sometimes worm castings or bat guano, and then they add various minerals and supplements to the mix. And while I do buy and use some of those commercially available composts, without a doubt, the overwhelming bulk of that which I use in my garden is homemade, and I like that for a variety of reasons. I start most of my compost piles in autumn as I accumulate and use the fall leaves that have come down from our trees. Then I add other ingredients like the hay and straw that I use for goat bedding, kitchen scraps of eggshells, coffee grounds, and vegetable trimmings. And I even like to go down to the beach and add seaweed to my compost pile. By keeping the pile moist but not wet, over time it heats up, decomposes, and breaks down. What we're left with is nature's way of recycling nutrients. And our compost is really alive, filled with earthworms and other insects that will continue to add nutrients into the soil where I spread it. Normally I set up irrigation lines throughout the garden, but this past winter was one of the wettest on record, so I occasionally did some hand watering. And all the vegetation around the perimeter of the garden had grown lush and tall to the delight of Alice and Charlotte. But one morning I found this, a very large snake swallowing a pretty good-sized rabbit. And this was me about 2 minutes later doing my annual weed whacking. I didn't want to stumble on another snake. I'm down with all the critters back here. I just like to see 'em coming. This year I filled up quite a few 5-gallon pots with nothing but our homemade compost and planted some of those tomatoes that we started from seed just to test how they would grow in the compost that we made here on site. When these tomatoes are finally played out, I'll dump the contents of the pots into new compost piles, which is really us mimicking nature's grand recycling program. The starts from Tomatomania went in the westernmost portion of our garden, and my wife helped dig the holes for planting. We amended the space with an organic potting mix, and then I put in some biodynamic compost. I later topped them off with my homemade compost and then a layer of mulch. One of the unique aspects of planting tomato starts is that roots will actually grow from the main stem when you plant that root ball nice and deep. So it's a good idea to strip away some of the bottom leaves, put the root ball in deep, and the plant will set better. A common mistake people make with growing tomatoes is overwatering. You want to soak them about once a week, but let them thoroughly dry out between waterings. Both these potted tomatoes and the first tomatoes I got at Tomatomania have a lot of room to grow, but here I'm using my favorite garden tool called a broad fork to prepare a row of tomatoes I'm going to plant about a foot apart. You can think of a broad fork a bit like a heavy-duty pitchfork, and the blades, or tines, sink deep into the soil. As I lean back, I lift up a chunk of the ground, and this action provides better airflow and water penetration into the ground without being as pulverizing as a tiller. Soil structure and earthworms are preserved, and along with some compost and amendment, this ground will be ready for our new planting. I started these tomatoes and tomatillos from seed, and when they get large enough, I'll drive some stakes into the ground every 6 feet or so and string them up to support the weight of the vines. In my garden journal, I made a note of what varieties I planted where, the date that I put them in the ground, and ultimately I'll make notes about the quality of the harvest so I know what to grow in future years. This year we decided to go real big on our pepper patch, and we have almost 100 plants in the ground, ranging from sweet to spicy to hot to downright crazy. Most of the plants were started from seed, from those peppers that we enjoyed last year or in previous years, but we did go out and find some new varieties to include. We've found that the sweet peppers usually start producing first, and the hottest peppers usually aren't ready until late fall. But the nice thing about a pepper patch is that it produces all summer and fall long. And of course, when we go back and collect all these red plastic cups, we're gonna reuse them again, season after season. We harvested a lot of great vegetables out of our garden this spring, and I'll share some of the highlights with you, and we'll even share some of the challenges we've had. The list of benefits for having a vegetable garden go on, but a couple of highlights come to mind right away. One of which is that you pick at the optimal ripeness. There's no packing and transport and decline of nutrients that's associated with commercially picked and packed vegetables. In our garden, we control the quality. We control all the inputs so we know what we're getting. And we enjoy growing and eating unique heirloom varieties that you just don't find anywhere else. A lot of times they're not commercially viable, perhaps because the produce doesn't ship well, doesn't look pretty and uniform, or perhaps the vegetables or fruit don't all ripen on the plant at the same time, making harvest more difficult. In this and the last clip, I'm harvesting different kinds of lettuces, and our salads were the bomb this spring. This particular patch is a mesclun mix of different varieties. And while this patch and a couple others grew really well, I did have some challenges with insects that were probably in part due to the overhead watering that I was doing. For example, these are earwigs, commonly called pincher bugs. And here I'm hand picking out roly-polies, also called potato bugs. The bugs were a challenge, but they weren't so overwhelming that I felt I needed to use organic pest controls like neem oil or diatomaceous earth. I did, however, give my first shot at making a biodynamic pest control preparation, which involved putting those insects into rainwater for a month and eventually spreading that fermented liquid across my garden, which is supposed to deter them from returning. I can tell you that preparation stunk pretty bad, and that's reason enough for them not to want to come back. But there were a few crops that did eventually succumb to the insect pressure, like our Brussels sprouts or green romaine lettuce. And in those cases, I fed those plants to my goats, who didn't mind at all, or the newest members of our families, our chicken, who I'll talk about shortly. Radishes are a fast-growing and cold-hardy crop that I planted in late winter, and they were a great addition to our salads. Here I'm harvesting the purple-bulbed melaga and the white-bulbed zlata, but we also grew icicle tall top and watermelon radishes. As the weather starts to warm up, a radish will begin to bolt to seed, and in doing so, they produce hundreds of edible pods that have a texture of a sugar snap pea with a little bit of that radish zing to them. We ate a lot of those radish pods and also let a lot fully dry out so we would have seed to replant next year. We spread some carrot seed in late fall and it started to sprout, but through the winter, every time we had a frost, it would kill off those tender young starts. So it wasn't until early spring that the carrots really started to grow. These carrots are called dragon carrots, and they're from seeds we grew last year, purple on the outside and orange and yellow on the inside. And these are scarlet nantes. A farmer friend told me to oversow my carrots and other crops, and I can pull them out young to thin and enjoy them all season long. And we did. We were pulling bunches of carrots throughout spring. The heirloom beets I harvested included Chioggia, McGregor's favorite, and Shiraz tall top. We enjoyed them roasted, and we pickled them in apple cider vinegar. This is the first year we grew out a pea called sugar magnolia, which is quite unique. It's hypertendral, and the pods are a beautiful blush purple color. We saved some pods for seed, and it's a variety I think will grow out again. This year we grew 4 different varieties of garlic, about 100 bulbs in total. We planted in early November, and a rule of thumb is that harvest typically comes between Mother's and Father's Day. I used the pitchfork to reach under and then pull out the garlic bulb, these being elephant garlic, which is actually in the garlic family but closely related to leeks. Garlic can be divided into 2 categories, hardneck and softneck. The hardneck put up what are called scapes. If left to grow, those scapes will bloom into flowers, but you do want to cut them off so that it'll encourage growth in the bulbs, and you can use those scapes in your cooking. The garlic needs to be dried out or cured, and for most hardneck varieties, we cut off the green tops. Here I put those into a compost bin, and then I'll put the bulbs in a warm, dark shed, probably for a couple of weeks to fully dry out, then they'll store for nearly a year. This year I took a shot at braiding one of my softneck varieties, and I think it came out kinda nice, wouldn't you say? We harvested quite a few other crops in spring. Here I'm cutting a Savoy cabbage. Each one was delicious and nutritious, and they were very gratifying to grow and eat because they came from our garden. My stone fruit trees, like the plum and peach, show their blossoms in late winter, but it's not until early spring that my citrus trees start to bloom. When our orange, tangerine, and grapefruit trees along our driveway start to blossom, it smells absolutely heavenly. I like to go out in the quiet early mornings and pick orange blossoms just as they're starting to open up. I'll harvest them over the course of about a week, week and a half, and I'll put them in trays into a dark shed to dry out. This is what the blossoms look like in a couple stages of the drying process, and when ready, they make a wonderful addition to my tea collection. This year our apricot tree gave up a good harvest, and here I demonstrate my shake the tree harvest technique. Our yields were low because the squirrels enjoyed much of the fruit before ripeness, but fortunately the quality was high. The fruit on our tree ripens quickly, and you can only eat so much fresh fruit at once, so we make jam out of the extra. We just add a little bit of lemon juice and a little bit of sugar and cook this delicious smelling brew down to a consistency that's ready for canning. We pour the hot jam into sterilized jars, and once sealed up, we'll boil them again for about 10 minutes, a process which kills any potential bacteria and gives it a longer shelf life. That's some good stuff. And if we don't eat it all ourselves, it makes a great holiday gift. Watch my dog Maggie as she's introduced to our first 4 chickens. She is staring intently and licking her chops with an occasional drop of drool. We had wanted chickens for a long time, and I had been buying some especially good eggs at a farmer's market where often I'd wait in line for 15 or 20 minutes to get them. We care not only about the nutritional quality of the eggs we were buying, but also about the animal welfare. And of course, the best way to ensure both of those variables is to have chickens of your own, just like all my neighbors have. I remember reading in a book by Joel Salatin, who is the organic farmer behind Polyface Farms, that it's important to let your chicken be a chicken. They need to scratch and hunt for food, get some worms, be active and entertained. And of course, you'll have more nutritious eggs when they have a diverse diet. So in addition to having organic chicken food available for them at all time, we also put piles of not fully decomposed compost into their pen so they can scratch and peck for worms and bugs and food scraps, and eventually we'll return all of this compost back into our bins for further composting. You can see not only are our chickens entertained, but in this case, Alice is entertained watching them. The art and the science of growing food is something I really enjoy, and it's a learning process that I'm sure will never end. Currently, I'm learning about biodynamics by reading a book by Rudolf Steiner called Agriculture, which is really a series of lectures he gave in the 1920s, and I volunteer at a farm that's converting from organic to biodynamics. Biodynamic agriculture really was created in response to the introduction of chemical fertilizers, and it was the forefather to what is now called organic agriculture. But the biodynamic process really takes into account so much more than what you don't put on the soil. Instead, it focuses on what we do put in the soil, striving to create the most nutrient-dense and healthy environment for our plants to grow. It considers the animals, the water, the people, and even the stars and the moon. And that might be a far out concept for some, but for me, having been on the coast all my life and seeing how the tides are affected by the moon, well, it's something that I can approach with an open mind. I try and take away the best practices of every gardening style that I look at and blend them all into my own amalgamation that I take to my garden. After all, each garden and farm is as unique as the gardener and farmer that tends to them. Now, I'm grateful for the privilege of volunteering once a week at a farm in Malibu. Here I'm delivering some giant sunflower starts from seeds that I grew out in last year's sunflowers from my garden. I suggested they plant them right on Pacific Coast Highway to draw eyes and customers into their farm stand. Once in a while, I get to drive their little orange tractor. It's a highlight job, and the seat on this tractor is like being on a throne. A very noisy and dusty throne. This is a small farm, so all they really need is a small tractor. And tillage is disruptive to soil structure, so it's only done between harvests or to mix weeds in as green manure. This property has been an organic family farm for decades. But there's a new person curating this property. Her name is Carrie, and I'm glad that I've become her friend because she's the most knowledgeable person I know when it comes to food and its impact on our health. She's assembled a team of other key players here whom are also experts in what they do. In particular, there's Farmer Jack, who's a vibrant 82-year-old gentleman. He's an expert on biodynamics and compost. And Farmer Dave, who's a no-nonsense, conventional farmer, although he respects that this is an organic farm and treats it accordingly. Here, Farmer Dave's crew is planting tomatoes, and in just a couple of weeks, those tomatoes grew so big that his crew here is stringing them up in rows to support the vines. I've had great conversations with all the key players here at the farm. Carrie often tells me about different foods, their nutritional values and health benefits, and how they impact our lives. Jack helps me understand the book that I'm reading about biodynamics and shares with me some of the more esoteric concepts involved, which really help me understand how everything is connected in both seen and unseen ways. And of course, Farmer Dave is a very practical, get things done kind of guy. Controlling weeds is a huge challenge for farmers, and that's no exception here. The truth is that weeds are indigenous plants that are well equipped to take the water and sunlight from the crops you're trying to grow. So here we do the weeding by hand. In this clip I'm using a hoe, and we'll accumulate all the weeds and put them in a giant compost pile to decompose, eventually to be returned as nutritious soil back to this land. One morning we were having a conversation with Farmer Dave, and he was making some very valid points about conventional farming practices. He's referred to as a minimalist because he likes to use as little chemical intervention as possible, but he explained that on large farms, sometimes it's impossible to have the labor required to do weeding by hand. He explained that a lot of these chemicals are very expensive, so in reality, farmers use them in a very limited way, unlike what is often portrayed where every field is doused with all of these chemicals. Dave also expressed an opinion that's common with conventional farmers, that nitrogen is nitrogen, so synthetic fertilizers, which are often petroleum-based, are no different to a plant than other forms of nitrogen. During this conversation, I felt like I could read Jack's mind, a biodynamic farmer who recognizes that it's the context that nitrogen is delivered in that makes all the difference. Off the top of my head, the best analogy I can come up with is like saying vitamin C is vitamin C no matter how you get it. Whether it's in a tablet, it's no different than having citrus and fresh fruit. Of course, it's the context in which these nutrients are delivered that makes all the difference. On this particular day, I was harvesting mulberries, and I had the pleasure of doing so with a gentleman named Clint and his dog Bindi. The technique for harvesting mulberries was to vigorously shake the tree, and the ripe ones would fall onto a tarp, where we would pick them up and put them in baskets. And as much as I enjoyed the process of harvesting the mulberries, it was the conversation on this day that was especially nice. Clint is a practitioner of natural and holistic medicine, and just the day before I had my annual physical exam with my primary care physician. Fortunately, I'm in good health, but during my exam, I asked my doctor what he thought of genetically modified foods, and without hesitation, he told me he thought they were perfectly safe. I was surprised by this response, so I went on to ask what he thought of all the chemicals, pesticides, fungicides, herbicides that are sprayed on and absorbed by these conventionally grown foods. Now keep in mind my doctor's a smart guy. I've been seeing him for years, and he told me that he hadn't seen any large population studies in respected medical journals with positive peer reviews that showed that organic food is any safer than conventionally grown foods. I pressed the discussion a little bit and asked my doctor what he thought about water contamination, soil degradation that were caused by so many of these agricultural chemicals. We didn't get into the environmental impact of different agricultural practices, understanding it was beyond his scope of expertise. But my gut reaction, pun intended, was that this all just didn't sit well with me. So my doctor and I had a spirited discussion, and I told him that I would forward to him those studies that he was looking for so he could in turn advise his patients to eat organic foods. By contrast, most of Clint's patients had been failed by the traditional medical system, so they sought him out as an alternative. He extensively profiles his patients, and so often he finds that it's their diet that's the source of other ailments. Now don't get me wrong, my sister's a pediatrician, my brother-in-law is a gastroenterologist, and Western medicine has so much to offer on so many levels. My point in all these discussions is to find some truths about food and health and the connection between the two. As I sat in my garden picking chamomile flowers in the evening of the last day of spring, just an hour or two before the solstice, I had a lot to think about. Had I let my inner hippie get the better of me? After all, Farmer Dave had made some good points about the limited use of agricultural chemicals and the gray area between what is considered organic and what isn't. And my primary care physician is convinced that conventionally grown foods and genetically modified foods are as safe as their organic counterparts. Maybe I didn't need to be paranoid every time I went out to a restaurant and they didn't have a complete organic menu. But as I absorb all of these facts and think about them carefully, I ask myself, do I really want to gamble with my health? Do I really want to gamble with the health of our environment? And of course, the answer to that question is no. None of this is worth any of that risk to me. Nothing is more precious than my health, the health of my family, and our planet and generations to come. So I'll continue to eat healthy organic foods, and I encourage you to do the same. Thank you, my friend, for watching this video. I hope you learned something, I hope you enjoyed, and I wish you a long and healthy life.